I have been asked, more than once, what I thought I was doing. Usually the question comes from someone in a uniform. Sometimes it comes from a journalist. Once it came from a Sithothany consular officer who sat across from me at a folding table in a transit processing tent and studied me with those wide amber eyes the way you might study a structural fault in a load-bearing wall. What I thought I was doing, I told all of them, was feeding two small children and filling out the paperwork that kept them from being taken. That is the whole of it. That is the event they wrote the report about. The Frontier Medical Station at Kevel Crossing was not a large place. 4 pressurized tents, triage module, and a supply depot that leaked at one seam whenever the wind came from the northwest. I ran the commissary. I was not a soldier, a medic. Not trained for any of the things the station was technically supposed to handle. I could source protein packs from 3 different wholesalers, keep a propane line from freezing at -12, and bake flatbread in a convection unit that was missing one rack and had a door that wouldn't latch. That was my expertise. That was the entirety of what I brought to Kevel Crossing. I found them on a Tuesday morning, early enough that the medics were still on their second round of coffee. I was doing inventory in the back of the supply depot, a job I did every Tuesday because the automated count was never right, and I moved a crate, saline packets, and there they were, 2 of them. Small the way Sithani children are small, the broad pale foreheads and the fine silver white hair and the oversized eyes that catch light, like still water catches light. They were pressed together in the corner behind the crate, not moving, not making any sound at all, just watching me. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment. It was not fear. I know people expect it to be fear, or at minimum a kind of species instinct alarm, the ancient mammal part of the brain firing a signal that something unknown is close. I did not feel that. What I felt was closer to recognition. I had grown up with a sister who was 7 years younger than me, and I had spent a significant portion of my childhood learning to read the specific stillness a small person achieves when they are trying very hard, not to be found. I recognized stillness. I recognized what it costs. I set the inventory tablet down on the nearest shelf. I crouched, I said, in standard, which I did not know if they spoke, that I was going to go get them something to eat, and that I would be right back, and they did not, to move. The smaller of two, a girl I thought, though I was not certain and would not ask, reached out and took hold of the hem of my apron before I could stand. She did not pull, she just held it. That was enough. I did not go anywhere. I sat on the floor of the supply depot, and I opened a ration kit that was meant for the afternoon meal, and I portioned it out between us, 3 of us, and we ate flatbread and reconstituted bean paste in the cold back corner of a tent at the edge of a transit zone, and I asked them no questions, because they did not have the words yet, and I did not have enough patience for the ones I would have had to ask. They stayed for 3 days before anyone noticed, and I choose the word notice deliberately. I want to be clear that the medics and the support staff at Kevel Crossing were decent people under significant pressure doing difficult work, and that none of them were looking for reasons to cause harm. They simply assumed that if 2 small alien children were eating at my table, and sleeping on 2 cots I had assembled in the commissary corner, I had the situation in hand. Which was accurate. I did have the situation in hand. The situation was that 2 Sithani children had crossed the transit zone alone, for reasons I would not fully understand until much later, and had found their way into a supply depot and were now in my care, and I intended to keep them there until something better presented itself. The Inquisitor unit arrived on a Thursday. There are different kinds of authority, and I have learned to read them the way you learn to read weather. The medics who ran the station carried the authority of competence. They knew things, they did things, and their rank was a secondary fact. The Inquisitors who came to Kevel Crossing carried a different kind entirely. It was the authority of procedure. They came with forms. They came with a jurisdictional mandate regarding unregistered alien minors in a contested transit zone. They came with the specific and unhurried confidence of people who understood that paperwork, wielded correctly, was as effective as anything else. They came to the commissary at 11 in the morning. There were 3 of them. The one who spoke was tall, angular, unhurried, and entirely certain of how this was going to go. I had the children behind me, at the table, eating. The inquisitor told me the children were unregistered. I told him I had registered them that morning. He told me I did not have the authority to register alien minors at a frontier medical station. I told him I had registered them as dependents under my own name and forwarded the filing to the Colonial Administration Office at 7:42, and that I had the transmission receipt if he wanted to see it, which I pulled from my apron pocket and held out. He did not take it. He told me the registration was procedurally invalid. I told him I was happy to wait while he contacted the Colonial Administration Office directly to discuss the validity question, and that in the meantime the children were registered and therefore not unregistered, and I would appreciate it if everyone kept their voices at a reasonable level, because the little one had already had a difficult week. He told me I was obstructing a lawful collection order. I told him the flatbread was almost done. I want to be honest about this part. I was not calm. I have a temperament that other people sometimes mistake for patience, but is in fact a very specific kind of stubbornness. I do not raise my voice, and I do not move when I have decided not to move. And these two things together can look, from the outside, like equanimity. It is not equanimity. It is the particular stillness who has made a decision and is now simply waiting to see what the other party is going to do about it. What the inquisitor did after 45 minutes was leave. He told me this was not over. And I told him the Colonial Administration Office was open until 5. The children finished their flatbread. There is more paperwork in the official account. There were 2 additional visits, a formal challenge to the dependent registration, a counterfiling, and eventually an intervention by the Sathani consulate that resolved the jurisdictional question in a way that rendered the inquisitor unit's mandate void. The consular officer, the one who looked at me like a load-bearing wall, told me that my filing had created a chain of documented custody that made the collection order impossible to execute without triggering a diplomatic incident. I told him I had not planned it that way. He studied me for a long time, and then said that perhaps I should have, and I took that as a compliment. The handover happened on a clear morning, cold. The sky at Kievil Crossing, that particular hard blue it gets in late autumn when the cloud cover breaks. A Sathani community ship had been routed from the nearest resettlement corridor. The consular officer was present. There were forms. There are always forms. The girl held my hand until the last possible moment, not pulling the way she had held my apron hem in the supply depot, holding. The boy. He was the older of the two, and more contained about everything, the way some children are. Stood at left side and looked up at me once before they walked toward the ramp, and what was in that look I have no adequate word for. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something older and less transactional than gratitude. It was the look of someone who has decided, on the basis of available evidence, that the world contains at least one reliable thing. I stood on the landing pad until the ship was out of sight. People ask what I learned from all of it. The journalists ask it. The debrief officers ask it. Even the consular officer asked it, at the end of our last meeting, with what I believe was genuine curiosity. What I learned is this. There is a version of the word stay that has nothing to do with staying in a place. It has to do with staying in a decision. Children did not teach me how to be brave. I was not being brave. I was being stubborn in the presence of people who confused paperwork with power. What the small ones teach you, if you let them, is simpler than bravery. They teach you which things you are not willing to move away from. I have not moved.